Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a buried, almost totally forgotten chapter in the history of modern computing. We all know the polished, triumphant story of Apple, but behind the authentic early Apple logos and those pristine product shots, there lies a messy, chaotic, and frankly fascinating history of trial, error, and some serious ruthlessness.
Just listen to this. They paid the tractor drivers to drive over the equipment to make sure all leases were destroyed. Sounds like something straight out of a corporate espionage thriller, doesn't it? But no, it's entirely real. This is an actual eyewitness account describing a day in 1989 at a landfill in Logan, Utah. We're talking about a tech giant deliberately, brutally crushing thousands of its own groundbreaking multi-million-dollar investments right into the dirt. So, why would they do that? What on earth were they trying to bury? Well, to figure out this mystery, we've got to go back to the very beginning.
Section 1. The Dawn of Apple. Let's look at this rapid rise. Picture this. It's 1976. Two guys named Steve, Jobs, and Wozniak are literally building the Apple I in a garage. Just a year later in '77, the Apple II practically invents the personal computer industry as we know it. From there, the pace is it's staggering. By 1979, they're already hunting for the next massive leap, which leads to a super fateful visit to a facility called Xerox PARC. And that single visit? It triggers this frantic race that eventually births two incredible competing machines, the Apple Lisa in 1983 and then the Macintosh in 1984. Seeing the real historical photos of Jobs and Wozniak from that era, you really get a feel for what a wildly rapid, chaotic progression it was, from a grassroots startup to the absolute edge of a graphical revolution.
Moving on to Section 2, Lisa, the $10,000 prototype. This was a wildly ambitious sandbox.
First off, we absolutely have to shatter one of the biggest legends in tech history. The story usually goes that Steve Jobs just walked into Xerox PARC, took one look at their graphical interface, and totally stole it. Well, actually, scratch that. That's a total myth. The truth is, Apple literally paid for that access with Apple stock, and more importantly, they didn't just copy the tech, they completely reimagined the whole shebang. They're the ones who invented overlapping windows, pull-down menus, and those friendly, descriptive error messages. They introduced the whole drag-and-drop file tray concept. They essentially took complex code and practically invented the modern desktop experience from scratch.
But here is the massive catch. $10,000. That was the price tag back in 1983. Because the Lisa was doing so much, true multitasking, massive memory usage, object-oriented document management. It required incredibly expensive hardware. So despite being an absolute technological marvel, that staggering 10 grand absolutely doomed the Lisa in the consumer market. It was just way, way too expensive for everyday people.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Utah Landfill Massacre, the dramatic end of the Lisa.
So the Lisa completely flopped. Apple actually rebranded it the Macintosh XL for a bit before finally just throwing in the towel. But then a third-party company out in Logan, Utah, called Sun Remarketing stepped into the picture. They struck a deal with Apple to take all these unsold, unwanted Lisas on consignment. And here's the brilliant part. Sun Remarketing figured out how to upgrade them with a software called MacWorks Plus. This made these super powerful Lisas run exactly like the newer, hugely popular Macintosh computers. And they sold them for just over $1,000. Suddenly, consumers actually wanted to buy them. For a brief moment, this little Utah company had totally saved the Lisa.
But, as you might guess, Apple was not thrilled about this unauthorized comeback. Remember that landfill we talked about earlier? Yeah. Apple abruptly sent in corporate muscle, literally big, intimidating guys, to reclaim their property. They marched in and pulled roughly 2,700 of these upgraded, perfectly usable machines directly off Sun Remarketing's loading docks. They demanded every single mouse, every keyboard, every cable. You have to ask, why crush 2,700 perfectly working computers? Well, this quote hits the nail on the head. Apple didn't want a cheaper, modified Lisa competing with their shiny new baby, the Macintosh. It was purely a ploy to get them off the market so they wouldn't have to compete with themselves. It was a ruthless, coldly calculated corporate decision. Apple was literally willing to bury its own past in a literal landfill just to clear the runway for its future.
All right, Section 4, Macintosh and the Cult, the rise of a new devotion. The difference between these two machines was just night and day. The Mac was essentially a stripped-down, much more folksy version of the Lisa. Where the Lisa was this complex, $10,000 multitasking beast aimed at businesses, the Mac was a $2,500 single-task machine. It used little floppy disks instead of a massive hard drive, and crucially, it was marketed simply as the computer for the rest of us.
But Apple knew this new machine had to be more than just a tool. It had to be a whole experience. Take the startup sound, for example. This is a great little detail. Later in the Mac's life, an engineer realized that the original startup noise was this harsh, dissonant tritone, which was just awful to hear right after your computer crashed, right? So he changed it to a bright, happy C major chord. He designed it specifically to act as a psychological palate cleanser for frustrated users. It's such a surprising, tasteful anecdote, and it really shows how deeply Apple cared about the emotional vibe of using their tech.
And they cultivated that emotional connection very much on purpose. They positioned the Mac as the ultimate rebellious anti-IBM alternative. Empowered by that legendary 1984 Super Bowl commercial, they transformed what was essentially a cold electronic box into an extension of the user's identity. Like a friend, almost. They focused passionately on design aesthetics, and in doing so, they inspired a fiercely loyal user base. People who would defend the Mac to the end, even when those early versions seriously lacked software and hardware power.
Which leads us into Section 5, Steve Jobs, the machine. The paradox of the architect.
Looking at the real, historical photos of Jobs, this quote perfectly captures his driving force. He was singularly focused on making Apple succeed. Whatever was necessary, good or ill, was something he was totally willing to do. Impartially speaking, the guy possessed an undeniable, world-changing brilliance for design, marketing, and pushing teams way beyond their limits. But he also possessed a chilling ruthlessness. If an employee stood in the way, gone. If 2,700 perfectly good computers threatened the Mac's market share, crushed in a landfill. Good or ill, he just did what he felt was necessary.
And honestly, that leaves us with a really tragic irony regarding his legacy. The sources point out that Jobs was a man who literally revolutionized how humanity communicates. He put tools in our hands that connect us to the entire globe through beautiful, intuitive screens. Yet, he famously struggled to maintain warm, empathetic connections with the actual people directly around him, maintaining this notoriously cold corporate grip on his empire.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we're left with today. Can we actually have this kind of world-changing, paradigm-shifting innovation without the uncompromising, extreme, and sometimes deeply flawed personalities driving it behind the scenes? It's a really complex relationship between our perfect machines and their very human creators. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it leaves you with something fascinating to think about the very next time you turn on your screen.